Alex Winter, first of all, thanks for your time and for being here with us.
Sure.
And in first place, I want to ask you, why should the Panama Papers matter to people?
The Panama Papers leak at first appeared to be about people not paying their taxes and certain people in government or in business or other very wealthy individuals not paying taxes or hiding their money. Some things that they did seemed to be were criminal. Some things that these clients did were legal, but unethical. The more people dug into the story, because it was a very deep leak, the more they discovered that we're really talking about systemic corruption, sort of a global system that prevents trillions and trillions of dollars, not just $1 million here, $1 million there, but sometimes greater than the GDP of a country. That money is being kept out of the public pool. So the reason it matters is when you think of these things, you think, oh, well, who cares if a rich person doesn't want to pay their taxes? But when you're talking about trillions and trillions of dollars, the sheer quantity, the vast amount of money that is being kept out of the public pool, that is supposed to be part of the public pool, then that is your health care, those are your roads, that is your clean drinking water, that is your ability to have education. That is essentially the infrastructure that keeps your country functioning.
Because in the documentary you manage the idea and the fact that people are victims of that system, no?
Well, absolutely, and it affects everybody, frankly, rich or poor, because we're talking about a very wealthy or very powerful subset of any given society that is doing this. So you may think, well, I'm doing okay, and yet you may still have a problem with your health insurance or your roads or your ability to pay back student debt. And you're not thinking that if we didn't have this corruption issue, if we didn't have this system in place that is siphoning so much money away, you would have the ability to have access to all of these things. It wouldn't be a problem. There's more than enough money that is being siphoned out to solve most of the basic infrastructure problems that most countries have.
Okay, and why did you decide to produce, film, and direct the Panama Papers?
When the story broke, I recognized that it was a very significant story globally, and that there were two things about the story that interested me that I didn't see discussed quite in this way. And one was that you had this revelation of this giant system of corruption around the world that was in every country and was not a partisan system of corruption. It wasn't a right-wing system of corruption or a left-wing system of corruption. It was unilateral. So that was very significant. And I didn't feel that in some ways the general public was able to grasp, as we talked about, why it mattered to them. But then on the other side of it, you had this incredible story about journalism. You had, by an order of magnitude, the largest coordinated act of journalism ever in history. And so it was a way of telling a story about some very bad things that are going on and the effort that it took to reveal those things. And in telling that story, I also wanted to tell a story of journalism in the current era. In the age of technology, when it's a lot of papers are going out of business, and the way that journalism is practiced is changing radically. There's a huge threat to journalists around the world, in every country around the world, including at my home in the US. So it's difficult sometimes to do investigative journalism at a time when we need it more than ever, at a time when the world is shifting towards authoritarian governments, when the public has less access to the truth and less access to resources. We need journalists more than ever. So it was an opportunity to tell that story of the heroism of hundreds and hundreds of journalists around the world coming together to expose this corruption and what it means to practice journalism today.
The Panama Papers involved journalists, almost 400 journalists of 76 countries.
Yeah, there were close to 400 journalists working the story before it broke, which means 400 journalists around the world working in complete secrecy, not telling their husbands or wives what they were doing, all of their communication completely encrypted. Once the story broke in April of 2016, hundreds and hundreds of more journalists came on. I think now, at this point, there are well over 1,000 journalists that have been working the Panama Papers story around the world.
This was in 2016, and the documentary was ended last year.
Yes.
And how and when did you come to be involved with the documentary?
How?
Yeah.
Well, I've made several documentaries, and they have tended to cover either political stories, technology stories. I've told other stories about journalists. So I collaborated with a production company in the United States, and then we sold the film to a big U.S. cable TV station network called Epix. Mm-hmm. And we made the film for them, and then we went from there. And it was a couple of years ago that I started working on it. And I immediately reached out to some of the core journalists who worked the story that I knew I could get access to. The Guardian in London, McClatchy and the ICIJ, who had really spearheaded the investigation, the Süddeutsche Zeitung in Munich, and then La Prensa in Panama.
And given the sensitive nature of the materials you were dealing with, what kind of precautions did you and your recording team take during the production?
I tend to do the same thing on most films because you always want to be careful, and not just for your personal safety, which certainly is included, but you don't want your media to be leaked. You don't want your data to be stolen. You don't want information that you're working on while you're working on a documentary to be revealed before you want it to be revealed. That's very important. On this story in particular, even though the Panama Papers story itself had broken early when we had started, there were a lot of things that were still coming. I mean, there are still things that are going to break. It's a giant story. There will be Panama Papers related news breaks for years. So there were certain stories we were ahead of. There were even upcoming leaks that we were ahead of that we didn't want to be involved in breaking early. We didn't want that to be our fault. So everything was encrypted. All of our communication was encrypted. All of our drives were heavily encrypted, and we just kept our mouths shut.
And what were some of the most difficult moments you and your crew experienced while making the documentary?
And we had a lot of challenges. There were certain countries that we went into that weren't friendly, given the subject matter. There were certain people I had to talk to who weren't terribly happy that we were making the film. That did talk to me, wouldn't go on camera, but were helpful. So we had to navigate that quite carefully. I'd say the biggest, not challenge for us, but one of the bigger rocks in the water while we were shooting was the assassination of Daphne, Galicia in Malta. And, that happened sort of only about halfway through our production, and it was very shocking to the entire journalistic community. It was very shocking to us, and we were dealing with her son Matthew, who was part of the ICIJ and was part of the Panama Papers team already on his own, separate from his mother. So it was quite complicated, and it really marked a shift in the, I would say, in the general attitude of journalists around the world. I think that pre-Daphne, there was already a growing sense of apprehension that things were becoming a little bit more difficult for journalists, including in the U.S. and including under the Obama administration. There were there was more of a possibility of being sued or threatened with jail if you didn't give up your sources in the U.S. But outside of certain regions, it was extremely uncommon, if not unheard of, for a journalist to be assassinated brazenly because of their work on a story. Certainly not in EU-based countries. And so Daphne, was assassinated in an EU-based country very brazenly and very specifically for her work on the Panama Papers story. So I think it really had a chilling effect on a lot of the journalists that I was working with and journalists around the world because it kind of marked a shift in the daring of attacks on journalists in other regions, in a greater number of regions. So there was more of a sense that, while I may be under threat, but I'm physically safe, that I really have to watch my back, no matter where I am, and no matter what government I'm under, whatever country I'm in, however protected I believed I was, I think has made the importance of journalism and the need to protect journalists that much more of an issue for people who may not have known about it before. I think it put that more on their radar. I think that it has an effect of a society or community coming together more around journalists and understanding that they're desperately needed. But we have also seen, we've seen Khashoggi, we've seen other attacks on journalists since Daphne that have been pretty brazen.
Tell us about your interest in the issue of inequality.
That was really the essence of what we wanted to talk about was the notion of income inequality and how that impacts everybody. How, given the complexity of economies in the banking system in today's world, when so many countries are linked together through networks and the way the world is kind of flattening out in a way, there's the ability to create very complex systems of inequality that will prevent people from having the ability to lift themselves up, no matter how hard they try. And that needs to be fought against. And one of the points we're making with the film is that one of the benefits of the information age is that we're in the age of the leaker. That's the age that we're in. We will see more leaks, and there will be more corrupt systems that are exposed. And because of the way technology works, when you expose a system, you can expose the entire system very quickly. The Panama Papers was talked about as the biggest leak in the history of leakers so far, way bigger than WikiLeaks, way bigger than anything else we'd seen, which sounds very impressive, but it's actually very mundane. Data is just hard drive space. So whether you've got this many hard drives or this many hard drives doesn't really make a difference. But in reality, the amount of data you can put on this many hard drives, that's an entire global network. Every email, every phone communication, every documented scan, everything. So that makes corrupt systems very vulnerable. So I think that while we have a lot of corruption to fight, people who are engaged in corrupt activities are more vulnerable than they've ever been of being exposed. And they know that, which is why we have the fight against journalists. They know that if you have a leak, it requires journalists to sift through that data and make sense of it and verify it and get that information out to the public. So that's the supply chain. And that supply chain has to be protected.
And also you mentioned at the beginning of the documentary the situation of inequality and poverty, similar of French Revolution?
Oh yeah, yeah. The propaganda or the way that sort of shell companies, hiding money, tax evasion, the way that's propagandized to the public is this kind of romantic idea that, well, governments are bad and they take too much of your money, and if you were in my position, you would do the same thing. You wouldn't pay your taxes because you earned that money, which is propaganda, really, because what's really going on is the people who are saying that, they're taking your money. They're not really taking the government's money. The government is a flow-through to the infrastructure that allows you to live your life. So that's kind of a propaganda message that is very effective. We're seeing that in the United States with Trump, that famous line in the 2016 election when he proudly said to Hillary Clinton, you know, only an idiot would pay their taxes. It makes me smart because I don't pay my taxes. But of course, Trump is taking our money in the US. He's not just earning money and hoarding it. He's literally pulling money out of the public pool. He's stealing everyone's money. So until the greater public begins to understand that, that sort of basic fact, it may be difficult for them to really take the action that they need to take to change the system, which is, you know, demanding legislation, voting for people who will fight for greater transparency, to open up transparency with offshores, and to prevent mechanisms like this from being allowed to function in the U.S. and the United States and the U.K. These systems are legal. You know, we're the greatest offenders of offshores and tax shelters of anyone in the world, far more than, you know, Panamanian law firms. So that needs to change, and that change, you know, from my country needs to happen from the ground up. In the UK, it needs to happen from the ground up. But the public has to recognize that it is theft, and so the sort of using the French Revolution, or sort of any public uprising as an analogy, is just to simply say at a certain point, at what point do you say enough is enough, and we need to take action.
The name of Donald Trump frequently appears in the Panama Papers. In addition, there are growing concerns about the nature and scope of his business and financial interests. And in the face of the upcoming US election of 2020, what are your thoughts on how these issues will impact the election?
Well, I think it's going to come down to how well the real news can circumvent the propaganda. Propaganda meaning certain news organizations that are going to willingly spout total fabrications, you know, Fox News and that type of thing, and then just massive disinformation campaigns that we have. America likes to blame Russia for a lot of things. They like to blame Russia for pretty much everything that's wrong with the United States, which, you know, of course, we've had an adversarial relationship with Russia through the years, but there's more disinformation coming from US-based actors than there are from anywhere outside of the United States. And, you know, until we begin, as a country, we begin to actually look inward at our own flaws, it's difficult to fix those flaws. Right now, we're very good at pointing fingers at everybody else. So I'm worried about the 2020 election, you know, because we need, you know, we have this enemy of the people rhetoric, we have this fake news rhetoric, we have a very strong propaganda force that is trying to mollify the public and get them to not listen to the truth, you know, get them to suspect the truth. And of course, that's working against their own best interests because we're already watching, as we knew we would see, we're watching the people who voted for Trump in the heartland lose their jobs, lose their health insurance, not have clean water. You know, the promises that were made for farming subsidies and factories that weren't going to take their jobs out of seas, that all went away right away. So these people are hurting, but they're also very susceptible to propaganda. So unless, you know, there is an ability for, you know, real solid investigative journalism and real news to break through that noise floor of lies, the election won't go well. And
what are your thoughts on the candidacy of Joe Biden and on the proposal of Elizabeth Warren to impose greater or bigger taxes on the very wealthy?
Well, I'm a big Elizabeth Warren fan. So I would, at the moment, she's about the only candidate that I like. There are other people who have good things to say. And I don't think she's going to win. But she is very policy driven. She's not personality driven. America loves well, everyone does, but very personality driven. Who's got the shiniest smile, I guess that's Joe Biden. Joe Biden should definitely not be president. So I'm very hopeful that no matter what happens with Warren, at least her policies can make some noise, and people will listen, and there will be some positive responses. I will say, because I did a lot of work on, I spent a lot of time in DC while I was working on this documentary, and I talked to people on both sides of the aisle, and there was a pretty strong push towards higher taxes and greater transparency in the US from the left and the right now. I don't think it's going to happen quickly. I think it's going to very slowly make its way up the food chain to legislation and actual, law. So I don't believe that a new president is going to, no matter who it is going to be able to break through and bring about immediate change that impacts this area. I think we're talking about, it's sort of like climate change. I think it's like 10, 20 years of hard work to slowly change legislation, regardless of who's president. But I'm very hopeful that we get a better president than we currently have.
We have to.
Yeah, which could be anybody, but yeah. I would just say that, given where I am, and I would sort of state my respect for the work that was done on the Panama Papers here in Mexico, and the sheer volume of data that needed to be sifted through, and just the lack of resources that anybody has in any country to sift through that much information and verify that much information. I mean, the work that was done in Mexico on the story is very highly regarded by all the other team members, and it's done under duress. It's done under a certain amount of pressure, so I was happy to bring the film specifically happy to bring the film to Mexico for that reason.